The Sega Saturn's a great video game system, but it has some challenges that impact every Sega Saturn collector. The Saturn's a region-locked game system, meaning it only plays games for the region in which the system was intended. Some Sega Saturn titles are rare, driving up prices and making them more difficult for collectors to obtain. And the proprietary disc format of SanDisk means if the laser in your disc reader burns out, it's game over. Fortunately, this is where kits like the Fenrir Duo come in. It's available at stoneagegamer.com and linked for you in the video description. The kit supports both the Model 1 and the Model 2 Sega Saturn and includes the ribbon cables for both 20 and 21 pin systems. Not only does the Fenrir Duo allow you to play backups of your favorite Sega Saturn games on a microSD card, it allows you to play games from any region, from systems from any region, making your gaming experience region-free. It also includes this handy bracket for mounting it inside your Sega Saturn. Installing the Fenrir Duo into your Sega Saturn is a breeze. There's nothing to solder and it only takes a few minutes. Before you start the installation, pop open the lid and make sure that you don't have a disc sitting in the disc tray. Next up, flip the Saturn around. You'll need to remove the small access door that's at the back side of the system. This is where the coin cell batteries are kept that allow you to save your games to your system's SRAM storage. And if you haven't replaced this battery in a while, now's a good time to do so. The Saturn has a rounded dome shape to the top of the lid, so it makes sense to put a protective cloth underneath the Saturn when you flip it over to access the bottom screws. Speaking of which, for all models of the Sega Saturn, there are 5 screws on the bottom of the system, 3 that are down in these wells, and there are 2 on the back side of the system that live inside these grooves. Remove the screws using a number 2 Phillips head screwdriver. And in the case of the Model 1 Saturn, there's an additional screw right next to where you plug in the power cord. It's important to keep things well organized during the disassembly process. You can use a screw tray like this one, linked in the description, to prevent your screws from getting lost. In the case of the Model 2 Saturn, you can just lift the lid up and remove it to separate the top and bottom halves of the case. With the Model 1 Saturn, the power supply lives in the lid, and there are several wiring connections between the lid and the system. Here's what I'd recommend you do instead. Take the lid and roll it from the back forward. On the power side of the system, there are 2 connections. The first one is a series of wires that runs from the power supply to the motherboard with a Molex style connection. The other one is a set of 2 wires that goes from the on/off button down to the motherboard. To disconnect the power supply from the motherboard, use your finger to pinch the locking arm on the back of the connection and lift straight up. To disconnect the on/off button from the motherboard, just grab and lift straight up on the connection to remove it from its socket on the motherboard. On the reset button side, there's a single wire connection that goes from the reset button down to the motherboard. Just lift straight up to remove this connection from the motherboard socket. The last wire comes from the door position switch on the lid, and it connects directly to the CD drive. Pull out from the connector to remove this wire. The top lid is now free and you can set it off to the side. Right next door to where you unplug the lid position switch is the power supply cable that goes from the motherboard up to the CD drive. All you have to do to remove this cable is just simply pull it outward and away from the CD drive. There's a data ribbon cable that comes out of the motherboard and goes into the Saturn CD drive. All you have to do to disconnect it from the CD drive is just pull straight out and away from the CD drive itself. Whatever you do, don't throw this cable away. You'll find out more about why in just a moment. There's a ground wire here that runs from the Saturn up to the CD drive. Disconnect both ends of the wire using a number 1 Phillips head screwdriver, then remove the screws in the ground wire and store them away safely as you won't need them for the Fenrir Duo. Strange though it may seem, the CD drive isn't bolted down anywhere. It just rests on 4 posts inside the Saturn. To remove it, just lift it up and set it to the side. Dust bunnies, say hello to my little friend. This plug-in duster provides unlimited compressed air for cleaning electronics, saves a ton of money over having to buy those compressed air cans over and over, and is better for the environment. There's a link for you in the description if you'd like to pick one up for your own setup. To install the Fenrir Duo, you'll need to remove the old ribbon cable first. Just like you did with the CD drive side of the ribbon cable, pull straight out to remove the ribbon cable from its socket. Be sure to select the correct ribbon cable from the kit, in this case a 20-pin ribbon cable, to replace the original ribbon cable from the motherboard to the optical drive. Be sure to note the direction and orientation of the cable and its pins when you remove it so that when you insert the new ribbon cable, you can make the pins for the new ribbon cable face the same direction as the old one. To install the Fenrir Duo into the Saturn, place it right on top of the 2 frontmost posts from where you removed the CD-ROM drive. It literally just rests on those 2 posts just like the original CD-ROM drive did. Remember that small bracket that came in the kit? Go ahead and grab it now. To reinforce the Fenrir Duo inside the Saturn housing, slide this bracket onto the back of the Fenrir Duo. You might have to stretch the bracket just a little bit to get it to fit completely around the back. It's a snug fit, but once you have it in place, it will help structurally reinforce everything moving forward. Regardless of whether you're installing the 20-pin or the 21-pin ribbon, in each of these instances, the pins need to face toward the inside of the socket, and the blue reinforcement will face the outside of the socket. The 21-pin socket's on the left side, and the 20-pin socket is on the right side. So for this example, I'll be using the right side socket for the 20-pin ribbon, with the blue reinforcement facing the right side or outside the socket, and the pin side facing the inside or the left side of the socket. If you're installing the ribbon cable for a 21-pin Saturn, it goes on the opposite side, with the blue facing outside and the pins facing to the inside. Remember how I said earlier not to throw away the old ribbon cable? Well, in this instance, the 20-pin ribbon cable that came in the kit was defective right out of the box, so I ended up having to reuse the original ribbon cable. If you reuse your original ribbon cable, be sure to inspect the end of the ribbon cable that you're going to put into the Fenrir Duo, and make sure that the pins on the ribbon cable face inward no matter which of the sockets you use, 20-pin or 21-pin. Also be aware you may have to rotate that end of the ribbon cable 180 degrees in order to get the pins to align properly for the Fenrir Duo. At the bottom left corner of the board, there's a connector for the power wire coming from the motherboard that originally went to the CD drive. Grab that wire and insert it into the socket at the bottom left corner of the Fenrir Duo. If you have a Model 2 Saturn, you can simply reattach the lid back to your system. If you have a Model 1 Saturn, you need to re-establish the connections between the top lid and the Saturn. I think it's easiest to put them back on in the reverse order from which you took them off. So that would start with the reset switch. Grab the wire from the lid for the reset switch and put it back into the socket on the Saturn. Next up, plug in the connector between the ON/OFF switch and the Saturn motherboard. Then plug in the wire connection between the power supply and the Saturn motherboard. Be sure to press down until the locking tab on the back of the connection seats with the socket. Just like when you remove the lid from the Model 1 Saturn, it makes sense to flip and rotate the lid, this time back onto the Saturn rather than away from it. Be sure the lid is seated correctly and make sure that none of the wires inside the Saturn are pinched between the lid and the bottom shell. You can now reconnect the top lid and the bottom of the Saturn with the 5 screws at the bottom of the case. And in the case of the Sega Saturn Model 1, don't forget, there's one single screw in the back of the system next to where you plug in the power cord. Don't forget about the back door where the coin cell battery lives. Push it down into the grooves and then press up to snap it into place. Now that you've got the Fenrir Duo installed, let's set up the microSD card with your content. The first step in the process is to make sure you have the most up-to-date firmware for your Fenrir Duo. I have the firmware download website linked for you in the video description. Of note on this page is that you can format your microSD card for the Fenrir Duo in either FAT32 or exFAT format. Scroll down on this page until you see the listing for the firmware section. Inside this section, you'll see a clickable link for download. Click the download link to get the most recent up-to-date version of the Fenrir Duo system software. On the same website, there's an FAQ section that lists the types of game files that you can use with your Fenrir Duo. You can use CCD image files, 𝐃𝐈𝐒𝐿 files, or in this case, I'll be using BenQ files in multiple file format. The Fenrir Duo interface can show screenshots that you take for your games, but there's also a repository hosted on this Google Drive that has a number of screenshots pre-prepared and ready for you to use with your content. Click the download button in the top left corner to download this repository in zip format. Now that all of this stuff is downloaded, let's get it unpacked. Open a File Explorer window and then navigate to the Downloads folder on your computer. If you downloaded the optional screenshots pack from the Google Drive, you'll need to uncompress it as it comes in zip format. Right-click, select Extract All, and here's what I recommend. You can take this entire path and just cut it all the way down to the word Downloads. It saves you the extra steps in just a minute of having to deal with folder and folder structure. Once you've decided where you want to extract this folder, click Extract in the bottom right corner. You'll no longer need the zip file once it's extracted. You can delete it and send it to the recycle bin in order to eliminate clutter out of your downloads folder. For your Fenrir Duo to recognize your screenshots, you'll need to change the name of the folder that you just uncompressed to, wait for it, Screenshots. The other things you see in the downloads folder here are the firmware file that we just downloaded from the website, and also a series of BenQ games in both USA and Japanese regions so that we can test out the region-free compatibility of the Fenrir Duo. To move this content over to the microSD card, I'll grab this File Explorer window and snap it in place on the left side of the screen. Next, I'll put the microSD card into an SD card adapter and insert it into the SD card reader on the computer. Then I'll take this File Explorer window for the microSD card and snap it to the right side. You can grab everything, including the firmware file, and drag and drop it directly onto the root of your microSD card. In fact, the firmware file must live on the root of the microSD card, but you can put your games in subfolders if you please. Remove the microSD card from your computer, insert it into the Fenrir Duo, and power on your Sega Saturn system. At first, it might look like nothing has changed, but give your system a minute to access the Fenrir Duo in the microSD card, and you'll soon see that you now have access to the game content you copied over. If your Fenrir Duo required a firmware update, it was taken care of automatically as soon as you turned on your Sega Saturn system. Pretty cool, huh? For screenshots to appear in the main interface of your Fenrir Duo, press the Start button on your Saturn controller. The first listing in the settings menu is called Enable Covers. By default, this is set to off. Change it to on here and you'll be able to see screenshots. Press the B button to go back to the main menu of the Fenrir Duo, and you'll now see that screenshots are represented on the right side of the screen. However, do take note that they may not always be available for every game that you have, and the file names on the screenshots might not always match the file names of the games that you have saved on your Fenrir Duo. You've put in the work, now it's time to have some fun. Let's try out both the Japanese and United States region games, starting with Sonic 3D Blast, which is known in Japan as Sonic 3D 𝐃𝐈𝐒𝐂𝐋𝐎𝐒𝐒𝐂𝐋𝐿. Since this is a Japanese Saturn, you'd expect a Japanese game to run correctly on it. But what about United States region games? Well, here's one of my favorite. Road and Track presents the need for speed. And sure enough, the Fenrir Duo has allowed play of both Japanese and United States region games on this Japanese Sega Saturn. A quick note here, yes, there is a 3D printed tray that you can print or purchase and use with your Fenrir Duo. However, I tried two different 3D prints, and in both cases, I was never able to get the Fenrir Duo to properly line up in the bottom tray, and I was never able to get the cover piece at the top to properly line up in the top tray on the Sega Saturn. It's definitely doable, as others have had success with this. Just be aware that if you go this route, your mileage may vary. This Sega Saturn is now on a whole new level, but did you know this is not the only Sega system that you can mod on this channel? Check this out. You can hack a Sega Genesis Mini to play the entire Genesis library of games in just a matter of minutes. Check out the video on screen and linked in the description and pinned comment.